He has spoken on the topics faith, family and freedom in Cuba, Belgium, Brazil, Congo, UK and all over the USA to crowds from 14 to 40,000. International leadership speaker, trainer and coach. Author of Learn to Raw Leadership, Attitude Hack, Live a More Excellent Life, 5 Battle Strategies of a Victorious Warrior. 2021 President's Lifetime Achievement Award recipient. Founding partner of the John Maxwell team. Toastmaster International Speech Competition semi-finalist. Founder of Tell It Like It Is TV, ThatGuyRocks.com and ThatGuySpeaks.com. Creator of Story Power TV, Transforming Grace TV, and Leading Leaders Podcast. Producer of 4 TV programs and podcasts for Liftable TV and World Trumpet Television as well as multiple social media channels. Please help me welcome J Loren Norris.
Have you ever felt like you've been left out of the conversation? You know that moment when you hear somebody chattering away and they mention your name, but they're not really talking to you, they're just talking about you. You don't really have a chance to chime in to defend yourself. They're just chattering about you from the wings. They're talking about you as if you're not there. It's horrible in an abusive type of a relationship, but you often see it in dating relationships and even marriages. You also see it often in the workplace. Water cooler talk. I say this about that kind of conversation. Your brand is not your logos, your color schemes, or anything of that nature, as much as those influence your brand. Let me define your brand as shortly as I possibly can. Your brand is what people say about you when you're not in the room. So what does it mean to perceive the narrative? To understand what that conversation is when you're not always a part of it? When that conversation often takes place without you in the room. But when they boldly reach the place where what they're saying negative about you, they're saying even while you're standing there. Now what do you do? That's what I want to talk about today on Leading Leaders.
Subscribe now for our extensive video library of leadership lessons promoting faith, family, and freedom.
I'm J Loren Norris with Leading Leaders Podcast. And if you've ever been in that spot where someone's talking about you and it's not favorable, and maybe it's not just about you, it's about the whole community of yous. Law enforcement officers, firefighters, first responders, politicians, ministers, pastors, preachers, and teachers. When I say community, I don't mean necessarily, while this may be true as well, your geographic boundaries. There may be a community that you live in. In fact, if you don't know this, ask someone who does what the song Gangnam Style is all about. The song Gangnam Style is actually a satirical mocking of a geographic community. How the people in that area live, think, and behave with their worldview about themselves and how they interact with the rest of the world. There are many places, we might say the Madison Fifth Avenue crowd. Yeah, that's a different mindset. We might say the Jersey Shore people. Different kind of a mindset. The Deep South, the Midwest, the flyover states. See, what we're doing is framing the mindset, the worldview, the ways that they communicate around their geographic boundaries, a community. In fact, I was watching a late night talk show the other night with Noah Trevor, and he was in a attempted comical way, flattering, if you will, the Southern dialect of the United States. Of course, he's from England. So he says, maybe he's not from England because he talks about his mother's tribe and their type of language. And he says it's very musical because they always start with a click at the beginning of their words. When he talks about people in the South of the United States, he says they sound like they're talking with a banjo in their mouth. That's an interesting way to look at someone. But when I say the narrative in and of a community, that's exactly what I'm talking about. See, the challenge is when you have an outside influence who's speaking about the flyover states or the southern part of the United States or Jersey Shore or Beverly Hills 90210. We're talking about a community of people who share a lot of things in common. Maybe it's just their geography, or maybe it's like Malibu. It's not just their geography. They chose that geography. They chose that neighborhood. In Dallas-Fort Worth, we have a place called Highland Park. You can't just accidentally end up in Highland Park, not only because the houses are very expensive, but the HOAs are very restrictive. The mindset of the people who live in that area are very restrictive. The security level in some of the immediate communities around there, like University Park, very restrictive. If they can't stop you from moving in because you can't afford the place, they might make it uncomfortable for you to be there if you don't fit in. Try going to the West Village and shopping and see if a $27 cup of coffee doesn't dissuade you from hanging out in the neighborhood very long. There are some real barriers to being an outsider in a community that you don't fit into. Some of those are intentional. Some of those are incidental. Now, the reality is when you're the leader in a community like that, the narrative of others outside that community who speak of your community may be favorable. They may be envious. They may look at your community and say, wow, I wish we could be more like X, with that level of security and that level of value for a home and that level of value for, the average car and the job and the salary and the reputation and blah, 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 blah. It might be negative in that everyone talks trash about your community because the streets are dirty, the lawns aren't mowed, the cars are all up on blocks. I think it's Jeff Foxworthy who said, you're a redneck if you got more cars in your yard than you have in your driveway. And most of them are on blocks. I grew up redneck. I know exactly what that means and what that looks like. Been there. Had those cars in my driveway. When I was growing up, that was the norm. The question, though, is how do you lead the narrative when the narrative about you, about your community, the group of people that you hang with, geographically, emotionally, psychologically, politically, religiously, when the group of people you hang with have a certain narrative about them, everybody has a way that they talk about them. How do you lead when that's the case? Well, I think the truth of the matter is we've got to be willing as leaders to stand up and say, I want to influence the narrative. I want to influence what people are saying about me and about our community. I want to look sincerely at how our community is viewed, the words that are being said about us, what people think of us, the reputation that we have. Is it true or is it not? I saw a Facebook meme the other day about, it was two Baptists walking into a Pentecostal church. Whether you're religious or not, the meme was funny. I believe it was two guys from Dumb and Dumber with these expressions on their face like they'd just seen the most horrific thing in their life. Well, if you're that stunned when you walk into a new community, if the environment is such a shock to you, then yeah, you would have that kind of expression. But is that a judgmental narrative about that community from an outsider who's not a part of that community? See where I'm going with that? See, it might be that, here's an expression that I heard for many, many years growing up because my stepdad was Army enlisted, high-ranking Army enlisted, 20 plus years of service, Army enlisted. But when he got out of the military, he used to say a phrase all the time, don't call me sir, I work for a living. Now, what he really meant by that, and that's an old turn of phrase, it's been around for a long time, the imperative implication was, if I were an officer, you would be required to call me sir. And if I were an officer, I would be a pencil pusher, a desk writer. I would be someone, a desk jockey, they would say, who always sits behind a desk. All they do is ride people. They've never done any work. Or some of them have done some work in the past, but they're not working anymore. They just retired early and went to sit at a desk. So to call a working man in the Army, an enlisted person, sir or ma'am, was to infer that they didn't work anymore, that they didn't do a hard job. And he took that as an offense to say, my community of working people, he was an aircraft mechanic, my people of hardworking people, my community of hardworking aircraft mechanic people, don't call us sir, that's an insult. That's saying that we're too lazy to work, that we sit around pushing a pencil. Now, I have to be honest and say, there's an old phrase that says work smarter, not harder. There's a lot of merit to that. There's a whole lot done in the world of leadership with a pencil and a journal. You may have heard the phrase, I believe comes from the 14th century, around the days of Shakespeare, that said the pen is mightier than the sword. The idea that we can communicate so much more intellectually than we can brutally. It's a powerful notion. If we didn't have intellectuals, officers, leaders who spend their time thinking, not just doing, we probably wouldn't have the level of peace, relatively, that we have in the world right now. So what is the narrative of your community? Have you listened closely, not just to the people in your community, but the people outside your community? Maybe you've heard since 2020-ish, the last, almost 2 years now, the phrase defund the police. And some people have different meanings by that. Others say, well, refund the police. And so the play on words is obvious there. Defund the police means take away all their money. Refund the police might mean, we want our money back. We want an exchange. We want to give back the product we have, the police, and get our money again. Others may be saying, no, give them back the money that we took from them when we were defunding the police. But you can see how the narrative and the rhetoric alone changes the impression of the community of law enforcement. That's one of many examples. The question is, as a leader, are you perceptive to the way people speak within your community and the way people speak about your community outside of your community? It's a real challenge as a leader when you are not up to speed, if you will. If you're not paying attention to what's going on in your community, you're not looking to see what others are saying about you, what others are saying to the members of your community. Trust me, there's a whole lot of outside pressure that will make an enormous difference on your organization when it's constantly pounded, whether it's by the media or it's the people around you or it's the people that you serve. If your client base, if your customer base has a negative opinion of you and who you are and what you do and what you provide them, you're going to have an entirely different kind of relationship with yourself. With yourself. See, think about how the negative community talk in the community and of the community impacts your own willingness to be a part of the community. Maybe it's who you voted for. Maybe it's where you went to school. Maybe it's where you went to church. Maybe it's the neighborhood you grew up in. I have said many times right here on this show, I grew up redneck in a small town in central Texas, more cows than people. There are some who instantly say, well, you ought to have a different accent. Well, you can't be real smart then. You didn't go to an Ivy League school. You can't be real smart then. And so there's an assumption about and an interpretation of the community that I grew up in, where I came from, that to some people automatically tells you who I am. There's an ancient text that said, nothing good comes from Nazareth. And the result of that conversation, or the implication of that conversation, was, well, if nothing good comes from Nazareth, then why would we listen to this individual? Obviously, they're not all that in a bag of chips. So how do you defend that narrative? Well, the answer is simple, more simple than you can imagine, but it's also absolutely imperative on the part of the leader. And that is, you have to lead the narrative. To lead the narrative in a community means you've got to get ahead of that conversation. You've got to have an idea what people are going to say about you as a community, about who you are and what you do and what your value is to the world. And if you're not already having the conversation with the people in your community, with you as you look in the mirror, with yourself and how you speak to yourself and about yourself, then what everybody else is saying about you might influence the way you think, might influence the way you behave. Leaders don't wait until their community is falling apart or is under pressure before they lead the narrative. No, leaders have the ability to step in early on, to begin that conversation, to tell the stories that are absolutely necessary to a strong foundation. To hold the conversation, to lead the conversation, that's the job of the leader. To tell the stories which lead people to believe and hold a positive view of the community that you belong to. Now, if the community has issues, if the way they engage with the world or the way they interact with each other is flawed, then it's also the job of the leader to change that narrative, to begin to help with that conversation that says, you can't talk to each other like that. You can't speak a demeaning manner to each other and then expect everybody else to respect you. A football team that hates itself, that hates each other, that's fighting and backbiting and arguing with each other on the field or off the field. That kind of disrespect will overflow onto the field on game day. It'll also overflow into the exposure that everybody around the team is like, yeah, those guys are just not a team. They're a bunch of talented players, but they're not a team. The same can be said of many workplaces. The same can be said of many relationships. I remember standing in line with my two boys in a Starbucks many, many years ago. We were on a long trip across the country. I think it was to Atlanta. And as we're standing in line, my two boys, my wife, I believe one of the girlfriends was with us, and there was a couple ahead of us, a young couple, probably early 20s. I didn't notice if they had rings on or not. But they kept punching each other and pushing each other and bouncing each other off the walls and stuff like that. And it kept going and kept going and kept going until eventually she started to cry because he bounced her off the wall too hard. And I looked at my boys and I said, there is no level where play fighting is good in your relationship. There is no place where play fighting is good in your relationship. Because what you're willing to do when you're playing, you're willing to do when you're angry. All you're doing is setting up a pretense for the opportunity to be abusive. If she accepts it, there's something wrong with her perception of herself. And if you participate in it, there's something wrong with your perception of you and your perception of her. Don't do it. Don't even get started. It's a slippery slope. And when you start down that road, the line of respect and injury will be crossed. I'm just telling you now. Okay, if you're in a relationship, the narrative of your relationship will be not only what you say to each other, but what others say about your relationship from the outside. When you look at a couple that has had a long, successful relationship, it's because they have mutual respect for each other. They take care of each other. They look out for each other. They've got each other's backs. They're not backbiting and arguing and talking negative about each other. They're not speaking to their parents ill of their loved one. No, they're defending each other. They're protecting each other. They're guarding each other. And that has to be true in a community of police officers, doctors, attorneys, a geographic community, a political worldview community, an educational community. It doesn't matter what your community is. If you are part of a community, your respect level for the other people in your community has to be high enough that you will defend one another. And that has to be present not only in your behavior, but also in your language. If you lead a community, if you're part of a community where your voice is even minorly listened to, then you hold influence in that community. And as an influencer in that community, it's your job to lead the narrative. So what do you perceive in and of your community? What kind of narrative exists about who you are and what you believe? If you don't like it, get busy changing it. That's your job. I'm J Loren Norris with Leading Leaders Podcast for Tell It Like It Is TV. Have a blessed day.